Thank you everyone for taking out time and choosing to attend the NES webinar today. We have with us Dr. Vishal Pawar. He's live from Dubai, from the UAE. He's a board certified neurologist with a keen interest in neurotology. He has received several awards and honors in his career. In 2017, he was awarded the Specialty Certificate Examination in Neurology by the Royal College of Physicians, and he runs a dedicated vertigo clinic at Aster Hospital in Dubai, which I'm told is equipped with infrastructure for advanced vestibular and neurological diagnostics. He will be taking us through several cases which have presented to him with the primary complaint of vertigo and imbalance and his approach towards them. At the end of the hour, we will have a lively discussion with the panelists. Today we have in alphabetical order Dr. Avinash Bijlani, who is a senior practicing ENT specialist from Delhi. He has a keen interest in the field of neurotology, and he's very experienced in this. He has diagnosed disorders ranging from vestibular paroxysmias to infarctions rather easily. Next, we have Dr. Sandeep Sharma from Bharti Vertigo Clinic, Punjab. He's known for his deep understanding of vertigo and a scientific questioning mind. Well, if you ever find time, his lectures on BPPV are full of passion and wisdom in equal measure. They're sort of very entertaining and very nice to listen to. And finally, Professor Srinivas Dorasala, a great teacher and head of product innovation at Cyclops. Well, some consider him the modern day father of neurotology in India, but a better description would be neurotology's best friend that we have at this time. With this, I hand over the mic to Dr. Pawar. All his slides have a number marked on them, and any query you may have should include ideally the page number if you must. There is some information about the NES, the membership form and presentations and YouTube channel, which we will discuss towards the end of this talk. And over to Dr. Pawar.
Yeah, I'll share my screen.
Yeah, share your screen. Yeah.
So, is it visible now?
Yes, you are very visible.
Yeah. At the outset, I would like to thank NES India for giving me this opportunity to present cases. And thank you, Dr. Kshitij, for kind introduction. So I'll start the cases. So I'll start the presentation. So these are my disclosures, like I have nothing to disclose. And what I'm sharing is my personal experience with the cases. And some of the findings which I'm going to share are like I didn't find evidence for that. So some of the findings which we can discuss in the panel discussion, and I have obtained informed consent from all the patients which I have shown in this particular presentation. So I have planned to present 8 cases, but we will rather than presenting all the cases, I'll present the cases which I can present like in the duration, like 1 hour. I'll try to present as many as cases in this particular time. So let us jump to case number 1. So this patient had a 2 years history, and when he presented to me, he presented in May 2019 at this particular point of time. So first, I'll tell what were his presenting complaint.
Last year, I am never going to write a book again. It was the most painful experience.
Yeah, I think someone's audio is on. Like, yeah, okay. So okay. So in May 2019, he presented to me with imbalance of gait, which one second. So imbalance of gait from 1 year, and it was non-progressive. It was static. When he showed to me, it was actually improving, and he was stable on labyrinthine sedatives. And the imbalance was asymmetric, like he was swaying more towards the left side than the right side. And he denied any other central symptoms like slurring of speech, any proprioceptive deficits, or pyramidal or extrapyramidal symptoms. Okay, so his quality of life was severely impaired because of these symptoms and imbalance, and he was not able to carry out the activities of daily living. And he had a very significant past history which is hidden, but I'll tell you later on, like after the presenting complaints, I'll go to the past history. Then I did his neurotologic examination and VNG when he presented to me. These are his findings. So
ऊपर हाँ फास्ट या वो हाथ से
so there was no appendicular ataxia.
ऊपर हाँ फास्ट पहले आंखें खुली रखिए अभी आंखें बंद कीजिए हाँ या ठीक है ना वो एक के आगे एक पैर रख के आंखें खुली रख के चलिए हाँ चलना है एक के आगे पैर टर्न करके वापस
So you can see he was swaying to the left side while doing the tandem Romberg's. So his Romberg's test was negative, tandem Romberg's was positive, and he was swaying to left side during tandem Romberg's also and tandem gait also. So then I did his VNG, which showed like with fixation first, there was no nystagmus with fixation, that is spontaneous gaze, and without fixation, if you can appreciate, there was right beating nystagmus. Like you can see, this is the right side and this is the left side, and there was subtle right beating nystagmus which was not seen in light, that is with fixation. Then on right gaze, with fixation there was no nystagmus, and without fixation there was right beating nystagmus on without fixation, and on left gaze with fixation there was no nystagmus, and without fixation there was again right beating nystagmus. Okay, so with fixation the patient was not having any nystagmus, and without fixation it was unidirectional nystagmus beating to right side. So to summarize the VNG findings, there was no spontaneous nystagmus in light, there was right beating nystagmus in dark, and there was increase in the amplitude of baseline right beating nystagmus on head shaking test. I did head shaking, which increased the amplitude of the spontaneous nystagmus. And patient had right beating nystagmus even on left gaze, and that is without fixation. And the intensity of nystagmus increased on looking to right side. So it was following the Alexander's law. And on optokinetic testing, there was directional preponderance, that is the gain for the right beating nystagmus was more as compared to the gain for the left beating nystagmus. So overall, if you look at the findings, there was unidirectional nystagmus beating to right, and usually in peripheral lesions, the site of vestibulopathy is towards the slow phase. So these findings are suggestive of left unilateral vestibulopathy. So the nystagmus was not direction changing, and the visual fixation, there was suppression. So these findings suggest that, like one second, yeah. So so whether the pathology is central or peripheral is always a very important question whenever a patient comes with vestibular disorder. That is the first question, a very important question we need to answer, whether the patient needs imaging or whether it is a peripheral pathology. So let us go to the past history. When in January 2018, patient had patient presented to another neurologist and a neurosurgeon with history of imbalance of gait for a month. And imaging was advised because I didn't see the patient that time. Obviously, the imbalance was progressive, and there might be some central findings. So imaging was advised, and I'll show you the imaging. The imaging showed this mass lesion, which was compressing the inferior portion of vermis. And you can see the medulla also compressed, and the paravermian areas are compressed. And it was predominantly compressing the inferior portion of the vermis, where the vestibulocerebellum is located. So the inferior portion of vermis, it was compressing, and so there was compression of inferior vermis. Okay, so patient was in January 2018, patient was diagnosed as infracerebellar meningioma, and he was operated like within once the imaging was done, he was taken for surgery within a week, and the same month he was operated. And he had worsening of his symptoms post-operatively. So his symptoms worsened immediate post-operatively. He had severe imbalance, nausea, vomiting, and the nausea persisted for 6 months, and it stopped later. And the imbalance improved a little, and he was put on beta histines 16 milligrams twice daily, and he was feeling better, like he was okay with that, like he was maintaining, but he was not able to carry out his activities as he used to carry out earlier. So so this is the like in January 2018, it is typically a central lesion, and May 2019, when he presented to me, I did his examination, and the findings were left unilateral vestibulopathy. So what is the reason behind getting this left unilateral vestibulopathy like findings in a pre-operatively looking a central case, and post-operatively when the patient came to me, I found peripheral signs. So what next? Like I had a question like, what shall I do? How can I improve the quality of life of the patient? So there were options for me, like how to work up this patient. So these were the options, and I went ahead with rotational chest testing. So I'll show you first one video, and then we'll discuss everything about the rotational testing. So you can see eyes, the neck is in neutral position, and there is a activation of full field retinal vision. So it is not fixed on one particular target. Full field retina is activated. So you can see the nystagmus which is seen. It is due to vestibular optokinetic stimulation. But as soon as the patient fix the gaze on the target, this vestibulo-ocular reflex is inhibited. Even the optokinetic component is there because of vision is involved. So both the components are inhibited once the person fixes on the target. So this is vestibulo-ocular reflex suppression test. It's a very beautiful video, depicting how to test for this VOR suppression. So how this vestibular suppression, VOR suppression is achieved is it's a central function. We can switch the vestibulo-ocular reflex on and off, and it's a central function. And we will discuss which are the structures involved in this switching. So just now we have seen when the full field retinal vision is there and neck is in neutral position, and there is no fixation. If the person is not fixating on one particular target, there is vestibular optokinetic stimulation, that is VOR activation as well as the optokinetic stimulation. And the eye movement normally we see is horizontal nystagmus. But suppose the person fixate on a target, the foveal vision is activated, the neck was in neutral position, and the person was fixating. So there is suppression of optokinetic and optokinetic rotational VOR. and there was no nystagmus. There was no nystagmus. So how this is achieved is there is suppression of optokinetic system because of activation of pursuit mechanism, and there was suppression of VOR because activation of fixation mechanism, and the flocculus plays a very important role in this suppression of both these reflexes. So there was no nystagmus. So suppose a patient gets horizontal nystagmus while doing this testing on fixation, then it indicates that the patient has floccular dysfunction. Now we will see the effect of darkness on the same test. Same test, if we perform in darkness, the visual stimulus will go away. The neck is in neutral position, there is no fixation, and vision is denied. So there is only vestibular stimulation, that is rotational VOR activation when the vision is denied, and a person will have horizontal nystagmus. Okay, so that is the effect of darkness. So optokinetic stimulation will be out, and there will be only activation of the VOR. So now let us add a further component of head tilt into that is in light, the head tilt. So full field retinal vision, and ask the patient to tilt the head, and suppose the person is not fixating in the same during the same testing. There is again activation of vestibular VOR and the optokinetic stimulation.
Yeah, 1 minute, Dr. Vishal.
Yeah.
I think to show the video, you are showing this thing also, right? I mean, you put it video optimization mode, right?
Yes, yeah.
That's why most of the participants, when you use video optimization mode, the text becomes blurred.
Okay.
For others. So can you stop that video optimization mode and put it on only when you're showing the video?
Yes. I have.
Yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yeah. Now it is okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it is okay. When you're showing video, you put it on again.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the best to the
Shall I continue from this, or shall I
continue? No problem. Continue from this.
So when the full field retinal vision is activated, and you ask the patient to tilt the head during the rotational chair testing, and the person is not fixating on one target, then a person will have, in addition to the horizontal nystagmus, the patient will have vertical component, because there is addition of the head tilt. So so there is activation of otolith pathways also, and the vertical canals are also stimulated. So that leads to additional component of vertical nystagmus. So yeah. Now suppose you do the same test in darkness, like suppose the same head tilt test and rotational chair testing is done in the darkness. What will happen is there will be only activation of vestibular system, the optokinetic we have taken out, and the person will again have the horizontal and vertical nystagmus, and both the components will have almost equal amplitudes. But suppose you do the rotational chair testing in this way, and you find that the horizontal gain is higher as compared to the vertical gain, or the vertical component is missing, then that goes in favor of nodular dysfunction, because it's a function of nodulus. When the reference frame shifts, then it takes the inputs from the 3 semicircular canals as well as the otoliths, and that then it decides the output. It doesn't only activate the horizontal VOR pathway, the vertical VOR pathway to adjust according to the head tilt. Now to summarize, when the foveal vision is activated, there is suppression of optokinetic and VOR, that is vestibular stimulation, and there is no nystagmus in normal condition. But if you see a nystagmus, then it indicates floccular dysfunction. And in darkness with head tilt, what happens is a person will have both horizontal and vertical nystagmus. But if you see horizontal gain more than the vertical, it indicates a nodular dysfunction. So, so the test for floccular function is the first one, that is with macular vision, that is fixation, and there should not be nystagmus. And the test for the nodular function we will see later. So the first I did this test, that is foveal vision was activated, that person was fixating on the target and the neck was in neutral position. So here the patient is not supposed to get the nystagmus, but this patient had horizontal nystagmus. I'll show you another one video. The findings were very subtle because he came to me 1 year after the surgery. Might be prominent when he initiate post-operatively, but he had very subtle findings. I'll show you the graph. Yeah. So this is the VNG graph where I found the nystagmus during this testing with fixation. He was not supposed to get nystagmus, but he had nystagmus with slow phase velocity, as shown in this this slide. Then the next is so this patient had nystagmus during rotational testing with fixation. So he had most probably he had floccular dysfunction. And then I did the another test which is for nodular function, in which initially I did the rotational chair testing without fixation in light, like vision was not denied. And there the patient performed well, like the patient had both the horizontal and vertical component, which together leads to this diagonal trajectory of the nystagmus. And you can see here both the horizontal and vertical components were matching with each other. They were symmetric. Okay, and you can see here in the VNG readings, both the components were equal. So that then I did same test without fixation, that is with head tilt and without fixation. I performed the same test, and this is the result. You can see the horizontal component clearly, but the vertical component was a very subtle vertical component, or you can label it as pure horizontal nystagmus as well. And the VNG graph, it was picked up only as a horizontal nystagmus. There were no vertical beats. And here in the readings also you can see there was missing vertical component, and only patient had only the horizontal component. So so this test again is in favor of nodular dysfunction, because the patient had horizontal gain more than the vertical gain. So coming to who taught me this test and what is the reference for this testing. And now I attended NES 2019 in Bengaluru. And
so we started off with cerebellar signs. Now we are talking about nodulus signs, flocculus signs, fastigial nucleus signs. Okay, and it is quite simple. Is it very difficult?
So he is the man behind, because of, I got inspired with his talk, and I took his guidance to do all this testing. And let's go back then now to what went wrong in this patient, in this particular patient. What happened actually, why the patient is having this peripheral findings. Now coming to the pre-operative, this post-operative MRI, you can see that I'll show you the normal picture of MRI, then you will be able to appreciate. So look at this area. This is the area of vermis, and this is the nodulus, and this is the tonsil, that is nothing but the paraflocculus, and the vestibulocerebellar structures are located in this area. So because the tumor needed debulking, these structures were removed. That's why the post-operatively the patient had worsening. So yeah. So these structures, you can see they're conspicuously missing post-operatively. You can see this cerebellar tonsil and the paraflocculus area, and this inferior portion of vermis, because the tumor was needed debulking of that area. So now what are the treatment options for this patient? Like, okay, you have done a good diagnosis, but it's very important that to give a good quality of life to the patient. Patient comes with, patient is not interested in what is the reason behind these findings. Patient is more interested what quality of life we are going to offer. So these are the options. These were the options whether to continue beta-histine, add another vestibular sedative, or stop beta-histine and do vestibular rehabilitation. So in this patient, what I did is I stopped his beta-histine and started him on vestibular rehabilitation exercises. It was very difficult for me to convince him to stop the beta-histine. Ultimately, he got convinced. And once it was stopped, this is the follow-up. Like February 2020, he came. He completely recovered from his problem over a period of 1 year. He recovered from his deficits. There is no residual dizziness and imbalance, and he's very grateful about the improvement in his condition. So this was his graph of improvement. So coming to the interpretation, like patient had post-operative worsening secondary to the removal of that flocculonodular lobe, and that led to the findings which were suggestive of peripheral vestibulopathy. So take-home messages from this case are flocculonodular dysfunction can mimic like peripheral vestibular lesions. And I got one reference, which very interesting reference to share. In this particular reference, which is published in 2020, this year, amongst the list of cerebellar nuclei, they have, this author has mentioned vestibular nuclei, and he has written vestibular nuclei are considered to be cerebellar nuclei as their connectivity patterns are identical to those of cerebellar nuclei, and they receive input from flocculonodular lobe and from vestibular labyrinth. So vestibular nuclei are flocculonodular lobe is an extension of vestibular nuclei, and vestibular nuclei is also considered as a part of cerebellum, which is located outside the cerebellum. And this is one of my slide in my presentation from 2008 when I finished my medicine on approach to vertigo, and I presented this particular slide. Like there are two types of fibers which go to the vestibular system. One is indirect vestibular fibers, like it starts from the vestibular system, that is semicircular canal and otoliths, and it goes to the vestibular nucleus, and then it relays there, and then there are projections, that is indirectly it goes to the cerebellum. And there is another pathway which is called as direct vestibular cerebellar fibers, which don't relay in the vestibular nucleus, and directly it goes to the cerebellum. So all the fathers in this, like who are listening to this talk, will relate to this, that whenever a son has some particular demands, some demands he directly comes to me, to us, and asks, I want this. But some demands he comes through the mother, like he will tell first to the mother, and then she will propose that particular request. So vestibular nucleus is like a mother for the vestibular system, and flocculonodular lobe, which is located in the cerebellum, is like a father. So they are working like a family to maintain the balance. So that's why the flocculus and nodulus are extension of vestibular nuclei, and functionally it is a part of peripheral vestibular system. That's why peripheral vestibulopathy like findings you can see in flocculonodular lesions, and flocculus and nodulus are functionally a part of peripheral vestibular system. So the second message I want to give from this case is avoid labyrinthine suppressants. Don't, especially in chronic cases, don't just suppress the symptoms. Try to find out the mechanism why the patient is having these symptoms, and it's rewarding, I will say. And explain the patient that they might suffer in short term because of the dizziness after the drug withdrawal, but they can get rid of dizziness in long run. And especially in my practice, what I do is I request patients that please believe me for a few weeks. If you don't, if I'm not able to give you any answer, you are not feeling good, then you can show to another doctor, but just believe me for a few weeks. And the third take-home message from this case is learn the test for vestibulocerebellar dysfunction. And that is this floccular test and nodular test. and cerebellum has tremendous plasticity. Over a period of 1 year, patient recovered almost fully, despite of removal of major chunk of flocculonodular lobe. This happens because unless the deep cerebellar nuclei are involved, the cerebellum has tremendous plasticity. It can recover from the dysfunction. I'm going to present another case in which I'll show you that. And vestibular rehabilitation is mainstay of treatment for vestibular deficits. So that was regarding the case number 1. Now let us move to case number 2. So 45-year gentleman came with history of head injury 7 days ago, and he developed severe positional vertigo which was lasting for seconds, that is less than a minute, and on turning to either side, that is right as well as the left. Now coming, yeah, I think I need
Focus on the camera, eyes.
So I'll optimize the screen share for video clip. 1 second, yeah.
Closer, you can keep it like this.
So this was the right disc sulfide, and the patient had upbeating torsional nystagmus, and the upper pole of the eyeball was beating towards the right side. Okay, and then I went.
Come closer, only eyes.
Sulfide. You can appreciate
This dizziness is more or that earlier one?
The on the right hand side was more.
Yes.
So I hope the videos are clear. Are you able to appreciate?
Nice videos, yeah.
So left disc sulfide, the patient had upbeating torsional nystagmus, and this time the upper pole was beating towards the left side.
Come closer.
Now then what I did was supine straight head extension or deep head hanging maneuver. Then
It is going to happen mostly.
there was a latency.
Yeah, starting.
There was upbeating torsional nystagmus with upper pole beating to the right side.
Let me know once it stops.
It's stopping almost.
So there was a pause,
Starting again.
and which was followed
Going
by
the other direction.
yeah.
Earlier, how was the direction?
Opposite direction. He was twisting to that way. Now he happened this way.
Now it is twist
Stop.
this way.
Yeah.
It is.
So I'll summarize the findings of positional testing. When I did right disc sulfide maneuver, patient had upbeating torsional nystagmus. The upper pole was beating to right side, which is typically seen in right posterior canal BPPV. And on left disc sulfide maneuver, I think I'll that optimize, I'll uncheck. Okay. So the left disc sulfide maneuver, the patient had upbeating torsional nystagmus. Upper pole was beating to the left side. And when I did the supine straight head extension or deep head hanging maneuver, the patient had initially upbeating torsional nystagmus. There was a pause of few seconds, and it was followed by upbeating torsional nystagmus, and the upper pole was beating to the left side. So just I would like to mention few things about supine straight head extension or deep head hanging maneuver. It's a very good maneuver to test all the four vertical canals in one go. And I do it routinely in all posterior canal BPPV patient, and it's very interesting to see that you will see the same findings which you see in the disc sulfide maneuver in a case of posterior canal BPPV. And it helps to understand that it is not the maneuver but the nystagmus which is important for BPPV diagnosis, and the differentiation of anterior canal BPPV from apogeotropic posterior canal, it helps. And it helps to differentiate between bilateral BPPV versus bilaterally symptomatized unilateral.
Dr. Pawar, I believe you're getting your messages on your phone, and that's giving a notification. Do you want to switch your notification off for the telephone?
Yeah, 1 second. I'll do that. Yes. Okay. Is it fine now?
It depends when somebody sends you a message, we'll know. You can
Yeah.
carry on, please.
Okay, okay. So just a minute. I was here now, right? 1 second. Okay. So
We can't see your screen. You might want to share your screen again.
okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, yes, we can. Please carry on.
So in this patient, there were two differentials, like whether it is a bilateral BPPV or whether it is bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. So I went in favor of I thought it is a bilateral BPPV, and then I searched the literature, like how shall I manage this patient, and the what I saw was the management of bilateral BPPV. There is no, like, it remains unclear. The evidence was less clear. So I'll just show you one video, and 1 second. Yeah.
Namaste. बापू बोला, अगर दुश्मन बाएं गाल पे मारेगा ना तो दाएं गाल आगे करने का। ये ले, देख नहीं मारा ना।
Dr. Pawar, we can't see the video, but you can explain what's happening, maybe.
Oh, you can't see the video?
You can tell the gist of it. That's all right.
Okay. 1 second. Are you able to see my screen? Yeah.
We can see your screen. We cannot see your video, though. It's a blank screen.
Okay.
Switch off video optimization, maybe.
Okay. Can you see?
Can see the
Yeah,
image.
we can.
Yeah. So sometimes the evidence is not clear. So what we should do in certain cases, like sometimes there is no evidence, sometimes the evidence is unclear, sometimes the evidence is conflicting, or many a times what happens with me is I'm unaware of the evidence. Like I might not have read the right article regarding this. So we have to individualize the treatment in such cases. So then I searched the latest.
Dr. Vishal, I think you'll have to switch off the optimization again.
Yeah, 1 second.
Yeah.
Yes. Is it fine now? Like, yeah. So I searched the evidence for bilateral BPPV treatment. There are two options. One is two-staged Epley's maneuver versus one-stage Simmons maneuver. Okay. But what I did in this patient was like one-staged Epley's maneuver. Like in same setting, I did both the sided Epley's maneuver, right side and followed by the left side. And let us see the response.
It has gone.
Alhamdulillah, nothing.
What treated maybe? Nothing?
Nothing.
Both sides got treated maybe.
Nothing. Normal.
So this is supine straight
So congratulations then.
Thank you very much.
And
It has
so what I did was I treated right Epley's, did right Epley's, then I did left-sided Epley's after half an hour, and then I checked after 15 minutes. I checked like I did this supine straight head extension, and then that was the finding just now you have seen, and this is the follow-up. So can you please describe what happened, like how were your symptoms, and we did treatment day before yesterday.
My symptoms, to start with, my symptoms are very, very bad. It was severe to the point that I had to take support from somebody else to move around. My movement was very minimal. When we came, you've seen how severe it is. it wasn't one issue. I had problems with both. So we treated the first one, that was good. Then I waited, we treated the second one. I'm 99% better now.
Yeah.
Today we were at consultation, we realized that there is no flickering of the eye or anything like this. It's just over time it will go away as you explained. So yeah, it's very good, really, really good.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
So that was the response, and then what I did was I searched my data of posterior canal BPPV, and this is the only case of bilateral posterior canal BPPV. And I have seen one lady who had one-sided posterior canal and other-sided lateral canal BPPV. But this was the first case of bilateral posterior canal BPPV. And the earlier 5 cases I have seen where there was downbeating torsional nystagmus on other side. So that was a case of bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. But in this particular case, I have seen upbeating torsional nystagmus on both the sides. So it's very important to differentiate between bilateral BPPV versus bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. And I feel that bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV is very, very common as compared to the bilateral BPPV. And for example, if a patient has left posterior canal BPPV, the left disc sulpike testing will show upbeating torsional nystagmus in a bilaterally symptomatic unilateral BPPV. And other side, patient can have downbeating torsional nystagmus. Okay. So why is it under-recognized, this bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV? Because of maybe underutilization of the positional testing, or doing the positional testing only on one side. Suppose you do first right disc sulpike and you find nystagmus. We are tempted to treat the same the right posterior canal BPPV. If we don't check on other side, like some interesting findings which we might miss, or the other sided canal involvement also we can miss, like bilateral BPPV. And doing positional testing without Frenzel's or VNG guidance can also can lead to the missing those findings. Now coming to the mechanism of bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. So what happens in sitting with head in neutral position, you can see this is the posterior canal, and this is the sagittal plane, and you see that there is an angulation of around 45 to 56 degree of this posterior canal. And when we do the right disc sulpike, when we turn the head 45 degree, what we do essentially is we bring this posterior canal in sagittal plane, and then when the patient lies down, what exactly happens is this canalith drops down. Okay, this is in right posterior canal BPPV. Suppose it will drop down here in the dependent position, and the patient will have upbeating torsional nystagmus. Suppose the patient has a left posterior canal BPPV, okay, and you are doing the right disc sulpike position. So I will repeat again, the patient has left posterior canal BPPV and you are not doing the left disc sulpike, you are doing the right disc sulpike. What happens to the posterior canal is it is horizontal, exactly horizontal on the left side. So there is no canalith movement. Normally, there is no canalith movement, and you don't get any nystagmus while doing the right disc sulpike maneuver in a patient with left posterior canal BPPV. So that's why there is no nystagmus. But what happens is sometimes, like if there is the head turn is little excess, whenever the head turn is excess, what happens? This canalith can move towards the cupula, and it can cause the cupular displacement, ampulofugal flow. It can cause ampulopetal, actually ampulopetal movement of the this particular canalith, and that leads to downbeating torsional nystagmus, because ampulopetal movement in a posterior canal is inhibitory. So it leads to downbeating torsional nystagmus on the other side. So you are doing right disc sulpike testing in a patient with left posterior canal BPPV, and you might find sometimes downbeating torsional nystagmus on the other side. So this is the reference for this. Okay, and I got this reference from the Understanding Benign Paroxysmal Positional book. And now coming to the differentiation between bilateral BPPV and bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. Bilateral BPPV, usually it is seen in traumatic settings, but you can see in non-traumatic settings also. In last 10 years, there was one paper on this bilateral BPPV in non-traumatic setting. And bilateral symptomatizing unilateral BPPV is seen in a non-traumatic setting commonly. Then bilateral BPPV, you will have severe symptoms on both sides. Asymmetry is possible. It is because the severity may not be same. The particle load may be different. And there may not be symptoms or less severe symptoms on the other side in case of bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. And in this bilateral BPPV, you can find pure upbeating nystagmus if there is a cancellation of the torsional component. But in this particular case, I have seen there was no cancellation, but there was a pause between the two varieties of nystagmus. And here you can find only one-sided nystagmus. And there won't be any response to one-sided treatment in case of bilateral BPPV, and response to one-sided treatment in case of bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV. So the important point I would like to tell here is follow-up is the best teacher in treating benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, because it is the follow-up which tells us whether the patient improved with the same maneuver, whether the same canal is in the same canal, whether the patient has developed canal switch, or the patient has bilateral BPPV. The follow-up helps us to know that. Now coming to the another finding, that is in Epley's maneuver. This is not related to this particular case, but I just want to ask the panelists. We can discuss during once the talk is over. Coming to the Epley's maneuver, suppose you are doing Epley's maneuver for the left side, and you take the patient to the in the supine position. Then the canalith drops down. Then the step 3 is turning the head to the right side. So the canalith, like the posterior canal, is in horizontal position. There is no much displacement, and then we turn the head like patient looks down, and then the canalith drops down into the this utricle. So I just want to ask this question. After sitting up, whether the head should be maintained in a neutral position or there should be head bend, because what I have observed is this canalith, there is a possibility that the non-ampullary end of the lateral canal is nearer to the non-ampullary end of this common crus, and there is a possibility that it can switch towards this non-ampullary end of the lateral canal. And when the canalith is dropping down from this common crus, there is ampulofugal endolimb movement in the anterior canal as well. So that's why that is the originating. That's why sometimes you can see downbeating torsional nystagmus in this particular when the patient sits up after the Epley's maneuver. And there is a possibility, just now I discussed, that it can go into the lateral canal. So I have seen in one case where there was canal switch. I treated the posterior canal BPPV, and instead of asking the patient to wait for half an hour, immediately I tested in the Dix-Salpike, and that resulted into canal switch. So so I would like to share my experience that avoid immediate positional testing. Don't test it immediately. Like after 15 minutes or half an hour, you can go for the positional testing. And whether the head bend after this positional testing, this Epley's maneuver, it helps to prevent the canal switch. That is my question to the panelists. We can discuss during the discussion. So does maintaining the head flexion helps to prevent this canal switch? Now there are some other interesting findings which I would like to share. That is nystagmus which is seen in one eye versus the other eye. Like if you see the nystagmus which is seen in one eye is of around 7 degrees per second, and the other eye is around 22 degrees per second. So there is significant asymmetry in the amplitude of vertical nystagmus as well as the other components of nystagmus in patients with BPPV. So now you can see here, this is the right eye. I intentionally hidden the left eye. you can see that the nystagmus has predominantly a torsional component. I hope the video is clear. Okay. So the nystagmus appears to have predominantly torsional component in this video. And here you can see the same video. I have hidden the right eye. You can see that the upbeating component is predominant. You can see the movement of the upper eyelid. The upbeating component looks more predominant. Dr. Kshitij, is the video clear?
Yes, it seems to be very clear.
Yeah. So if you see both the eyes, you may not be able to appreciate this finding because one eye there is the torsional component is predominant, and one eye, if you see the upper eyelid movement, this is more in the left eye as compared to the right eye. So why this phenomenon happens? Let's see. If you see the posterior canal excitatory projections, it supplies the right-sided superior oblique and left-sided inferior rectus. And superior rectus is predominantly intorter of the eye. It does cause depression, and inferior rectus is predominant depressor. So that's why what happens in this posterior canal, this BPPV pathways, that is inhibitory and excitatory pathways, these muscles are not the same muscles. They are different muscles, and they have different primary actions, and they have different number of muscle fibers, nerve fibers, and number of motor units. You can see the number of muscle fibers, number of nerve fibers, and the size of motor units, and they have different innervation. That is the first finding. The second finding is effect of darkness. So in a patient with BPPV, what happens if you do the Dix-Hallpike testing with fixation, you will find sometimes you will find pure torsional or predominantly torsional nystagmus. And if you do in the same patient, recently I did testing that without fixation, you will find that it is actually a mixed variety of nystagmus. That is, patient has additional vertical component. You will realize it when you are doing the without fixation. So just we'll see the video. So with fixation, you look at the like the nystagmus. It is looking predominantly torsional nystagmus in both the eyes, like predominantly torsional. And in the same patient, during the Epley's maneuver, I did it without fixation. And you will see that the lead movement was more, and even the graphs also showed that this vertical component was more. So what is the mechanism behind this is central mechanism suppress the vertical and horizontal component more as compared to the torsional component. So they are not so effective to suppress the torsional component. That's why you might find pure torsional nystagmus during Dix-Hallpike testing. So it's better. So it's very important that before labeling it as a central nystagmus, most important thing is remove the fixation. Then also it remains pure torsional. Then we can call it central, and there is no response to the positional maneuvers. But if the patient has mixed vertical torsional nystagmus, then it is definitely BPPV. Then the third finding is the early versus late phase of the nystagmus. Okay, so just see this graph. In the first part of the graph, you will see that the slow phase velocities and the fast phase are almost equal. Okay, and the later phase, you will see that this is the fast phase and this is the slow phase. So as the time progresses, the nystagmus becomes more apparent. And during the early phase, you will not be able to differentiate whether it is downbeating or upbeating nystagmus. I'll show you one example. So it is very difficult to decide the trajectory of nystagmus in the initial phase, and the slow phase velocity reduces with time. So I'll show you one video.
افتح عينيك كأنه شايف بس خلي عينك مفتوحة.
So are you able to appreciate the whether it is upbeating or downbeating? In initial phase, you will not be able to appreciate whether it is upbeating or downbeating. But as the nystagmus progresses, you will see that now you are starting to realize that like it is like upbeating than it is downbeating. So what happens in the early phase, it's better not to interpret this particular video. I misinterpreted it as downbeating because I focused on the initial part. But if you keep concentrating on the later part of the video, then you will find that it is actually upbeating nystagmus. So it is very important to wait and see the nystagmus. The fourth important interesting finding is gaze dependent change in the nystagmus trajectory. So here it is upbeating torsional in the center gaze. Now when the patient looks to right side, it is appearing predominantly torsional variety of nystagmus. You see it is predominantly torsional looking. And when the patient looks to left side, it is appearing predominantly vertical. I'll show it again. So it is appearing pure torsional on right gaze. And when the patient looks to left side, it is appearing pure vertical. So why this phenomenon happens, I have already explained in another video. Like you can go to this particular link on the YouTube channel, and there is explanation of around 15 minutes. So that is another interesting finding which is seen in BPPV. So I think I'll stop here because I have already like my if a moderator allows, I can go for another case, or let me know.
So if you can finish the next case in 5 to 7 minutes, you're welcome to go on with that.
Yeah, I can finish. I'll present it 5 to 7 minutes. The case number 3 is 66-year gentleman, known diabetic hypertensive from 10 years, acute continuous vertigo from 3 days. So the presentation was like acute vestibular syndrome, and the hints plus examination forms very important part of examination when a patient comes with acute vestibular syndrome. So what I did is I did head impulse test. So I'll just tell you the finding. The patient had a head impulse test positive on the left side. And there was no nystagmus on fixation, there was no skew deviation, and there was no finger nose ataxia, there was no acute hearing loss. So these are the findings of hints plus examination, that is head impulse, horizontal head impulse was positive. There was no nystagmus with fixation, there was the skew was absent, and there was no acute hearing loss. So that question comes again, whether it is acute or whether it is central or peripheral. But I would like to highlight this. Very important to check the stance in patients. This patient swayed to right side. He was not able to stand, and he had wide-based ataxic gait, and he had tandem gait ataxia, and he was completely swaying towards the right side. Okay. So that made me to think of a central lesion, and I did his VNG also, which showed the subcards were normal. The horizontal smooth pursuit, you can see it was saccadic, and the vertical smooth pursuit was also saccadic. And the spontaneous gaze testing, there was no nystagmus, but in the dark he had right beating nystagmus, and this was the nystagmus which I have seen in the dark. It was beating towards the right side on the left gaze, and it was beating to the left side in the right gaze. So the patient had a peculiar variety of nystagmus called as centripetal nystagmus. So let us go to the table again. The patient had a centripetal nystagmus without fixation, which is a hardcore central sign. It is a very important central sign. Patient had severe postural instability. Patient had loss of balance with eyes, even eyes open. Patient had smooth pursuit abnormality, and he had gait ataxia. So this was typically a central lesion, and I did his CT scan, which showed right cerebellar infarct. And I'll just show you something interesting. Then I did analysis like from one of the book, like Louis Kaplan book. They have you can These are the areas which are supplied by different vascular territories, and these are numbered. That is, this is a cerebellar tonsil. So I tried to figure out which are the structures involved. So in this patient, the tonsil was involved. There was diffusion restriction in the tonsil and right biventral lobule. And there was also diffusion restriction in the other side. There was little small embolic infarct in the other sided pica territory. And the patient had infarct in the nodulus as well. The nodulus was also involved. I'll just show you. So yeah. So I'll just skip this slide and go to the final slide, which structures were involved. So if we look at the cerebellar structure, this is the vermis area and these are the paravermian, that is cerebellar cortex. And let us see which are the parts of vestibulocerebellum of our interest. So the parts of vestibulocerebellum are flocculus, ventral paraflocculus, which is nothing but tonsil, biventral lobule, and that is oculomotor vermis, nodulus and uvula, and the lingula. So these are the vestibulocerebellar structures, and the gray matter is fastigial nucleus. So these are the parts of vestibulocerebellum. Okay, these are the 5 functional areas of vestibulocerebellum. So in this, and if we look at the vascular supply of vestibulocerebellum, the lingula and fastigial nucleus is supplied by superior cerebellar artery, and the flocculus is supplied by the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And if you will notice that the nodulus and flocculus, they are supplied by different vascular territories. That is one important point. And second important point is functionally they are totally different. They don't have any functional connection. They are anatomically connected, but they don't have any functional connection between both of them. And they have different vascular territories. So now the vestibulocerebellar structures involved in this patient were the nodulus and the ventral paraflocculus. And the diagnosis was acute ischemic stroke, right medial branch of posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And the structures involved were these: right heminodulus, paraflocculus, and cerebellar hemispheres. And in this patient, the Unterberger's test was pivoting to the left side. So I'll explain quickly. The nodulovestibular fibers are inhibitory to the vestibular nucleus. So in this patient, the right heminodulus was involved. So what happens that because of this inhibition is lost, so the right vestibular tone increases. That's why this particular infarction in this territory mimics like left unilateral vestibulopathy. So that's why this patient had some findings which were suggestive of left unilateral vestibulopathy. That is, head impulse test was positive on left, right beating nystagmus in dark, and Unterberger's he was pivoting to the left. Okay, and because of right cerebellar hemispheric involvement, he had swaying to the right side, and he completely improved after day 10. Like in the 10 days, he was able to walk. There was little, and he was able to walk unsupported. So the learning points from this case are vestibulocerebellar lesions can mimic say peripheral lesions. This case is an outlier of Hentz. It's very important to go test the other signs also, like postural instability, smooth pursuit abnormality, and the other like testing without fixation. And so they can indicate the central lesion, and cerebellum has tremendous plasticity. This patient was unable to walk, unable to stand unsupported, but at day 10 he started walking without support. So cerebellum has a lot of plasticity. So that was
that's very nice, Dr. Pawar. Thank you for finishing that case in time. And now we have a series of first of all, let me thank you for a brilliant presentation, by the way. It was insight into the neurological and vestibular disorders. They kind of overlap, and I'm sure a lot of us will be reaching for our books again. You sort of shown us how much we don't know. Very humbling lecture. Okay. In fact, I should make a point here that when you said that the nuclei is kind of a part of cerebellar nuclei, I thought it's a evil neurologist plan to eat into autology territory, thin end of the wedge. But then you changed tracks and you said that the flocculus and nodulus are part of vestibular nuclei. And thank you very much for that. Thank you for giving that to us. Now, a few announcements before taking questions. Number one, we have the NES website, nesofIndia.com. If you visit that website, you can find the membership form. You can find the email of the secretary that you can contact to ask for membership. Also, the NES YouTube channel. The links are shared on the website, and through the website, you can reach to the channel also. That's the easy way out. I'll type the website name on the chat. So anyone who wants to sort of log on to that is welcome to do that. And now we have some questions for the panelists. Now, the first question that was there initially was that the first case that you presented, which was also kind of a cerebellar disorder mimicking more peripheral, is saccades and pursuit an indication that could have hinted it towards the diagnosis beforehand? Can I ask Dr. Srinivas to answer this?
Yeah, hello.
Can hear you. Please carry on.
Yeah, of course, saccades and pursuit, especially if there is a asymmetrical performance, then they can indicate. Generally, what happens is especially in pursuit, when you see, we come across pursuit which is impaired in both direction tracking. So they may not be much significant, but if you see a unidirectionally impaired pursuit, then that can be very helpful. And also in the saccades also, hypometria is not that helpful. Hypermetria is very helpful, and also pulsion is very helpful. Pulsion is directional pulsion, where one side there is hypermetria, and the other side there is hypometria. These things are very helpful.
Can I also comment?
Please,
yes, sir.
Dr. Sandeep.
So actually, positional test reports were not shown. They would have also demonstrated some central positional nystagmus in the case number 1. And considering the smooth pursuit, saccade, and all the VNG battery tests, one may not confuse it as peripheral vestibular lesion. I think positional tests would also have been helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. The next question actually is to you. There's been a talk for the first case that we are discussing. Do you think the prognosis of this case would have improved much on physiotherapy? I think when they say physiotherapy, the question also includes the vestibular rehabilitation therapy along.
Full recovery with vermis totally gone. Full recovery, is it possible? That is the question.
Dr. Pawar did mention that the patient recovered well. I'm asking of your experience in such cases, if you have any.
No, I didn't have a case where vermis was absent altogether, or will you? I don't think you will have a full recovery in such a case.
Dr. Pawar, could you tell, was the recovery sort of in relative to what the patient was beforehand, do you consider it success, or would you think the patient recovered well in absolute terms?
See, the patient had only problem in the inferior vermis, that is only involvement of nodulus and the adjacent structure were removed. It is not that whole vermis was absent. The other parts of vermis, that is spinocerebellum structures, they were intact. And I did mention that unless there is involvement of the deep cerebellar nuclei, or if they involve, then the recovery will be very late. This is given in literature. But if the white matter is involved and the peripheral, like cortical gray matter is involved, cerebellum has a tremendous plasticity to recover out of that function.
Brilliant. So what you're saying is, what I understand is that we can, based on the lesion position, we can give a prognosis about recovery based on what's affected. Thank you very much for that. My next question would be for Dr. Bijlani. Dr. Bijlani, can you tell me, in case you have a patient with, you suspect the patient to have BPPV, and when you're doing the diagnostic maneuvers, there are symptoms, but there's no nystagmus. How do you sort of take these patients?
Well, that's practically possible. And in such a situation, one should go ahead with the liberatory maneuver and if the response is positive in the sense that the patient symptoms have vanished once you've done the liberatory maneuver, I think I'll be very happy with it. But in case the symptomatology doesn't go away, then I would definitely be inclined to think of alternative pathology. And one of the reasons this happens is that sometimes these otoconia are lying scattered in the canal, and the kind of piston effect that's actually required to initiate the nystagmus is not there, but the patient does feel a bit vertiginous.
Okay, thank you. And if you have no nystagmus but only symptoms, would you be confident to know whether it's a posterior or lateral canal involvement based on the severity of
well, that depends on the maneuver. That depends on the maneuver that you are, or rather the positional test that you are doing.
Yes. Yes. So what you're saying is that
because if you're doing a test for the lateral canal,
on a Dix-Hallpike, then you would treat it for a posterior canal, and if it's more symptomatic on a McClure-Pagnini, you would take it as a lateral canal.
Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you for that. Now there was a brilliant discussion that went about bilateral BPPV and bilateral symptomatizing BPPV, and we have more clarification. Can Dr. Sandeep perhaps throw some more light on that?
Unilateral BPPV presenting as bilateral. The reason Dr. Vishal has already enumerated. Actually, I'll like to ask him, how did he differentiate whether it was unilateral or bilateral?
Dr. Vishal?
Yeah. See, in this particular patient, it was a post-traumatic setting. So it was obvious that patient can get bilateral BPPV in traumatic setting. Second is patient had upbeating torsional nystagmus on both the sides. And during the deep head hanging maneuver, what happened? Initially, there was upbeating torsional, beating to right, the torsional component, was followed by upbeating torsional again. If it was a reversal of the same nystagmus, then it should have been downbeating torsional in deep head hanging maneuver. Or if it was unilaterally, bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV, on the other side, Dix-Hallpike, it should have been downbeating torsional instead of upbeating torsional. So both sided upbeating torsional nystagmus made me to think of bilateral BPPV than bilaterally symptomatizing unilateral BPPV.
One other point is when you do a Dix-Hallpike on one side and it is robust on that side and on other side it is weak, then the robust side should be suspected as the affected side in a case of unilateral mimicking as bilateral, number one. Number two, when you correct the worst side first and you check both the sides immediately, if both sides are corrected immediately, that means it was unilateral mimicking as bilateral. Third is downbeating nystagmus, but many a times you may not, in such a case, unilateral mimicking BPPV, you may be, this downbeating component may not be that prominent, and that may confuse you. But the 2 points which I think are, one is if it is unilateral mimicking bilateral, the side affected will definitely have much more severe nystagmus than the other side, and it will, of course, it will get corrected when you the other side will also get corrected with the correction of the one side. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sandeep.
There was another issue which Dr. Vishal raised during his talk, and he said that once we are reaching the final stage of the Epley maneuver, should we bend the head of the patient down at the end of the maneuver when we bring him up in the sitting up position? I think that's not really required. One, if you look at the anatomy of the horizontal canal, that is pertaining to the, like the canal switch he was talking about. If you look at the anatomy of the horizontal canal in the sit-up position, the horizontal canal is raised up by 30 degrees anteriorly. So now in the sit-up position, actually, you can't expect the otoconia to move into the horizontal canal against gravity. In fact, if you put the head down, you are in fact promoting it to go into the canal by gravity. So I think you should never put the head of the patient down. You should not never flex the head. The head should remain in the neutral position.
Actually, if
there is no question of, and another point I want to raise over here is, I mean, actually we talk in terms of canal switch or re-entry phenomena. How many of them are actually recurrences, a recurrence in the same canal or another canal rather than a canal switch? Nobody really has the right answer to this. In fact, I am a very strong opponent of the belief that you really have canal switch. Because if you look at things anatomically, now I just gave you one example from posterior to horizontal canal. How is it possible? See that, look at the tilt. Look at the 30 degree, it is raised by anteriorly by 30 degrees and it is actually there's a slope. So how do you expect the otoconia to move into the horizontal canal? And moreover, the otoconia are not lying free in air. And in the utricle also, there will be some effect of gravity. They will tend to settle down rather than, they can't fly into the horizontal canal.
Yes.
If canal switch is occurring, it should occur during the maneuver itself, not when you make the patient sit up. Number one.
That is possible. During the maneuver, if the maneuver is done rather very, very wrongly.
Yes. Maybe. And second thought is Dr. Srinivas. Dr. Srinivas.
Yes, sir. I'm there.
The second thought which I am again putting is maybe during canal switch, it is not the particles in one canal going into the other canal. Maybe the other particles freely floating in the utricle, they went into the other canal during that maneuvering for the first canal. The fresh particles which were freely floating in the utricle at that time, they entered the next canal and they presented at that way. Dr. Bijlani, you are also justified.
So I'm so glad that Dr. Bijlani and Dr. Sandeep are in the panel because they have these original thoughts and concepts which are a breeze to listen to. My next question is for Dr. Srinivas. So, Doc, there was a video that Dr. Vishal played, which was about the rotational chair, and it said thanks to Dr. Srinivas for the permission. There was a question in the panel, in the chat box, which said, "Could you please explain the difference between rotational chair testing and Dix-Hallpike?" That's not the question. The point is the rotational chair testing. The next part is it the test for central vertigo? So I would want you to sort of maybe throw some light on rotational chair testing and central vertigo in one light, please.
Yeah. So actually, rotational chair testing, the way the rotational chairs are there, they are very prohibitively costly, and it is not going to be practical for them to be implemented in the clinical setting. So what we are doing here is not that exact measurements or whatever, but the principles. So we using that particular thing which Dr. Vishal Pawar showed is about a phenomenon called switching on and switching off of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. The difference, see, there is a similarity and there is a difference. The similarity is when you rotate in both situations, when the eye is fixing at the world, when the eye is looking at the world is one situation. The other situation is the eye is looking at your fingertip. In both of these situations, the similarity is the inner ear fluids continue to be excited, move or whatever, and the labyrinth, from the labyrinth, there is going to be action potentials that are going to be generated. But in one case, you are going to see a vestibulo-ocular reflex response in the form of a nystagmus. In another case, you don't get that nystagmus response in the form of a nystagmus. So when the mechanics or the movements in the inner ear is the same in both sides. So when the mechanics or the movement is the same, the physical factors are the same, then what is changing? What is changing is the ability of the center, the cerebellum, to determine the context, and based on the context, in one situation, allowing the VOR to run or perform is the correct response. In another situation, allowing the VOR to run is the wrong response. So based on these two things, the center is able to switch off. If the switching on and switching off is not possible, then you consider it as a central dysfunction. If it is happening, then that particular part of the center is working. Which particular part, as Dr. Vishal Pawar told, that is the flocculus.
We can call it as a poor man's rotational chair testing.
Yeah.
Available responses.
Yeah,
he's the billionaire who lives in Dubai. Okay.
So, could you go again? Your sound was not audible.
No,
could you go again?
I said it is a poor man's vestibular test.
I couldn't hear you.
Okay,
He
so
said poor man's rotational chair.
while I'm asking the next question, I could encourage the audience to put more questions in chat if they have any.
But it's a nice idea.
Yeah, it's a very nice idea. Now, the next question, which was already answered, but for the sake of reiteration, the last case, the case number 3 that Dr. Pawar showed, the VHIT was positive in a central sort of pseudo-peripheral disorder, so more central. How many cases, and this is open to the panelists and Dr. Pawar, how many times should somebody suspect that a VHIT negative, sort of a VHIT weakness can be got in a central lesion, and what are the signs, the hints, signs that we should cling on to prevent catastrophes where we might think something is peripheral but in turn is central?
Sir, can I speak?
Yes, sir. Please.
Number one, why are you mentioning VHIT alone?
So this was a question in the chat, and I'm just
why to concentrate on VHIT alone and to start with VHIT? You start with history, you start with the examination or your neurological examination, you start with your whole VNG findings. You will never get confused, because relying only on VHIT and then see, looking at it just a Romberg, you can't say it looks like a peripheral like Dr. Vishal Pawar showed. So at the outset, it looks like that. So one should not give that importance to VHIT and say it is peripheral. Second, Dr. Vishal, with due apology, I want to ask you, when he couldn't have that tandem gait and tandem Romberg was positive, what extra information we wanted to, again, I am asking with due apology, don't take it otherwise, why you went for this Unterberger?
Sir, as shown in the video, I did Unterberger's on day 6. I didn't do on the same day when patient presented to me. Immediately, I admitted the patient, went for scans. Aspirin
I thought it was immediate. Thank you.
No, I didn't do that, sir.
Okay, so and the 2 more questions. One is from Dr. Rohiwal, which I'll ask in the next minute. But before that, a simple early question. And this I would place to again Dr. Srinivas, or Dr. Sandhi. How many days prior to doing a vestibular test would you ideally, in the ideal situation, would you ask the patients to stop vestibular sedatives?
I think Dr. Srinivas he has been teaching from last 10 years. I once heard his lecture at pharmacology in Raipur, if you remember, a national conference. I think it should be around 2 days, 1 day, 2 days. But in majority of the cases, if a patient comes to me while taking labyrinthine sedatives, I immediately do VNG at that time, and then I call him again after 1 day or 2 days. 1 day, 24 hours is enough, I think, and then call him again and do VNG again, and then you can also.
Do you charge for both the tests? Or?
No. If I do operate on one patient for tympanoplasty, if it is unsuccessful, I reoperate free of cost.
Okay, that's nice to know. And is there any other thought somebody would like to share?
Same thing. So if the patient comes to us and is already taking the lab, whatever, I'm not one person who likes this term sedatives or whatever, because there is no labyrinthine sedative as such. Okay, everything is a different thing. It is not xylocaine. We are not putting xylocaine in the inner ear. Okay, so whatever. So that set aside, they do change the VNG findings. They do. There are drugs which do change findings on vestibular testing. So, but if the patient has already come back, I will not send them back. Okay, there you can still get may be able to reach a diagnosis. If I don't get anything, then I will call him back after 2-3 days after stopping. But if the patient has come by appointment, then I will tell them to stop for 2 to 3 days and come back.
Right.
If it is coming just like that, walks in, then just because the patient has already walks in, and just because the patient was on certain medications, I will not send them back. I will do the testing, and if I think that I have not been able to come to a conclusion, then only I will call again after 2 to 3 days.
Brilliant.
Generally, it is a plea to buy time when you are confused at diagnosis.
That is also there. There are many times when we want to go back and read up.
Yes.
There are many times.
That's very honest and very practical. Thank you. I mean, very few people have the nerve to sort of bring it up.
There's another angle to it. In fact, if you're going to delay seeing the patient by a couple of days, what you're going to find today, you may not find it after 2 or 3 days. For example,
Agreed.
if it's been a slightly longer standing BPPV, 2 days later, it might have resolved by itself. So let's see the patient when he wants to be seen, and let's at least arrive at some diagnosis if possible. And like my other co-panelists very nicely said, you're not able to get a conclusion, call him again, no problems.
Dr. Bijlani, we can read, we can discuss with colleagues. There is absolutely no loss of face in actually taking time. We can read, we can discuss with colleagues. I do discuss with colleagues many times, and that helps. Okay, and that helps in avoiding some investigations, in avoiding some delay, and actually giving the right medication.
Okay, now, sorry, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to add few things.
Please carry on.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. Sir, please excuse me. Just 1 minute. Okay. It was an excellent presentation by Dr. Vishal Pawar. I know that what happened today is like you have opened a lot of thought process in a lot of people. Okay. I have to head to another meeting. It is going to start in another 30 seconds. I really enjoyed this evening. Please excuse me, sir. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivas. You're always a pleasure to have this discussion.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good meeting.
Thank
Okay,
you, sir.
my next question is from Dr. Rohiwal, who has specifically asked Dr. Bijlani. It says, Dr. Bijlani, your opinion about bilateral BPPV and the choice of maneuver.
Well, it depends whether you're talking in terms of posterior canal bilateral BPPV or a horizontal canal bilateral BPPV. Okay, so I'll take horizontal canal bilateral BPPV first. In fact, when it's a bilateral horizontal canal BPPV, it's a very difficult and a very tricky situation. It's so tricky that, you know, like say if it's a geotropic variety, you get almost the same intensity of nystagmus on both the sides, the right head roll and the left head roll. And you don't know what you're dealing with. But anyways, so if there is some sort of a difference in the slow phase velocity on both the sides, I would take up the one with the more intense nystagmus. So once that is done, my usual routine habit is that I make the patient wait for another 20 minutes or so in my clinic, and then I recheck whether I have done the maneuver properly or not. So if when I do that, and then definitely if I've corrected for the right side, now the nystagmus will be much less as compared to the left side, because it's again, I'm dealing with a bilateral situation. So left canal will be symptomatic. I have not treated the left canal. So now I'll come to know, and then I'll treat the left canal. Now talking about the maneuver, I mean, it's up to you whether you want to do the barbecue roll or the Guffoni roll or any other method. And certain difficult cases, I in fact tell them to go home. If I've corrected one side and it's getting difficult to correct the other side, or the patient is getting some autonomic symptoms during this test, during the procedure, so then I would tell him to go and lie down on the opposite, on the now healthy side at home. That is called forced prolonged position, and that also helps. So done with horizontal canal, coming to posterior canal. I think any day, Epley is my choice. I think Dr. Sandeep Sharma is not going to agree with me. He favors Simmons. I know it.
No, you are very right. Epley is the first choice.
Epley is the first choice, no? But you used to prefer Simmons.
In those cases where I fail with Epley.
Okay,
but majority of the times then Simont also fails.
Yeah, so Epley is the right choice. In fact, you know, my the way I work is, when I'm doing a Dixall-Pike test, and supposing I've done it for the right side first, and if I get a positive response in the sense of an upbeating torsional nystagmus, I will not make the patient sit up. I will straight away proceed to the Epley maneuver, and I'll finish the Epley maneuver. Now, once I've finished the Epley maneuver, I would make the patient again wait for half an hour in the clinic and recheck. Now, when I'm testing for the right side, I would get nothing. But most of these cases, in the lying down position, when you turn the head to the left side, which normally would not do, you would get some symptomatology. So usually posterior canal BPPV doesn't get caught in my kind of working environment in the first go. Usually the patient comes back with symptoms, and when I recheck him, I find that yes, now the left is also involved. So in one sitting, normally I do not come to realize that he has a bilateral posterior canal.
Perfect. That's brilliant. We have one last question that I might want to take. Do we have something? Dr. Venus Patel asked a minute ago. I'm trying to find that question. Yeah. She's asking, do you recommend imaging in all patients of vertigo? This is open to Dr. Pawar first as a neurologist, because neurologists are sort of quite quick draw McGraw as far as imaging is concerned. So Dr. Pawar, do you order for imaging for all patients of vertigo? Or?
See, if you come to percentage of patients where I order imaging, suppose like I was analyzing my data. So out of 100 patients, I do imaging maybe in 5 cases, because most of these cases are vestibular migraine, BBPV. If it is a clear-cut case like a vestibular migraine, or it's like BBPV, persistent postural phobic dizziness, because these are the 3 common causes I see, and these 3 causes form around 70% of the cases. So I don't do the imaging unless the patient is not improving or patient is having some central signs. Honestly, I do around only in 10%, 5 to 10%, I can say.
And are you a minority in your community who does that? Or do you think that's the standard?
I don't know about but what I did, I can tell. Like, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I believe we are almost at time that we end this session. Before we end, I would like to tell you about the next session, which will happen on the 30th of June at 7:30 p.m. Indian time. India is 5.5 hours GMT plus. The topic is vertigo and autosclerosis. It is, I think, a mouth-watering topic for most otologists because it covers autosclerosis and vertigo together. That's Dr. Narendra Suratwala will be taking that, and the moderator will be Dr. Hitesh Patel. As panelists, you'll have Dr. Bijlani again with us, with Dr. Bhandari and Dr. Vishal Arora. And the NES website was shared, nesofindia.com. You can visit that to find more about the NES webinars, about the videos, about the membership. And with that, I thank Dr. Pawar for taking our time and treating us with brilliant lecture and brilliant visuals that we can see behind you. Even if they're morphed, they are nice all the same. And thank you, the panelists. Dr. Srinivas has left. Thank you, Dr. Bijlani and Dr. Sandeep.
Thank you.
And everyone have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Hitesh. Thank you, Dr. Vishal, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dr. Sandeep, too, for your nice inputs.
Thank you, Dr. Prahlad, for being so patient and kind with us and helping us to do this. Thank you, Dr.
I think
Prahlad.
he's the real man behind the show.
I know.
Dr. Prahlad is the real man behind the show.
Thank you very much, guys.
Without him, probably all these deliberations would have been impossible.
Yeah.
Thank
See,
you,
one input. I think Dr. Vishal Pawar couldn't present all the cases. I think we should extend, if possible, NES sessions to complete his cases in future. Okay.
Yes, sir. This
can we come back on a Sunday or something?
Yeah.
We'll continue as it is. We go. See, once we complete the current series, what we can do is we can make it once in a week forever.
Yes.
Not that we end it. Let it go on forever once in a week.
There's no dearth of good clinicians.
Yeah, that's what, Tuesdays with NES, something like that.
Tuesdays with Morris.
Okay.
Chalo, that's good. Good, okay, happy note. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night and have a good life. Bye-bye.
Good night, all. Take care. Yeah.